Okay, moving on to the rest of the proofs. The next proof, we're dealing with an angle bisector. And they tell us that AB is an angle bisector. They tell us that 3 and 1 are congruent to each other. So you want to go look in your proof packet and think about, what do I know if I know I have an angle bisector? Definition of angle bisector, the statement or example is that BP is an angle bisector of ABC. They've given us that part. If and only if angle ABP is congruent to angle PBC. So what that tells me is I go look at AB. It's an angle bisector. What does that mean has to be congruent to each other? That means these two angles here, angle 1 and angle 2, have to be congruent to each other based on the definition of an angle bisector. So then I'm going to look at step 3. They've gone to say 3 is congruent to 2. So I'm going to look back at my picture and see if somehow 3 and 2 are linked together. Remember, it can't be substitution. I can't use substitution with congruent signs. So when I go look up here, notice 1 is the link between 3 and 2. And when I'm talking about things being linked together by one common thing, my reason is the transitive property. And this time it's transitive property of congruence. Moving on to the next proof, and this one was quite long, so I've cut it up into 2 different slides. To begin with, they tell us H is the midpoint of FG. Line M is a segment bisector. They also told me this, which hasn't been written down here, so I'm going to add that to my statements that are given. Anything you use in your proof has to be stated. If I'm going to later use FG being congruent to CE, I've got to write it in my steps. So from there, I'm going to go to step 2. Look at your reason that they gave you. Definition of midpoint. Use your proof packet. Go read what definition of midpoint says. M is the midpoint of AB if and only if M is between A and B and AM is congruent to MB. Here, they've told me that H is the midpoint of FG. So look at your picture. H is the midpoint. That means these two pieces are congruent. So I can say FH is congruent to GH. That's all I can say based on midpoint. Go to step 3. Step 3, my reason is definition of segment bisector. So I'm going to go look in my proof packet, and I'm going to find definition of segment bisector. They've told me that CD is a segment bisector. I'm looking right here at this part. If and only if it intersects AB at its midpoint. So if I'm using definition of segment bisector, I'm either saying something is a bisector because I know it's hitting at the midpoint, or I'm saying something is a midpoint. So looking at my givens, I have already used this part. I used it in step 2. So what else did they give me? Where did they say segment bisector? Line M, which is this line, is a segment bisector to line CE. What does that tell you? That tells me that D has to be the midpoint of CE. That's all it tells me. I can't use the things I know to say anything else. All I can use is that the definition says if I know something's a segment bisector, it tells me something's the midpoint, and vice versa. So then in step 4, they have said that CD and DE are congruent. Why did they tell us? If you look at the previous step, they told us D is the midpoint, and based on definition of midpoint, I can say those pieces are congruent. So then we go down in step 5, and we have that FG equals CE. look up here at this dot. I've said they're congruent. FH is equal to HG. I probably should have written that so that they match up so I don't get confused. So I'm going to go back and erase that and put HG so all my letters match. And they also said CD equals DE. That looks like that there. So they've gone from saying each of those things are congruent to the fact that they're equal. Remember, that is our definition of congruence, and in this case, it's definition of congruent segments. So then I keep moving. On step 6, and I'm going to go ahead and fill this in since I'm on my new slide. They have said FH plus HG equals FG. We'll go back and look at your picture. They said that this piece plus this piece equals the whole thing. And you want to think back, what tells us that? Remember, our part plus part equals whole, which in this case is segment addition postulate. Well, do I have anything else in there that I could say part plus part equals whole? They've told you the CE part. So what two pieces go together to make CE? And it's CD plus DE. So then I move on to step 7. What happened here? What do I already have in previous steps that would cause me to say this? Well, as I examine the different pieces, this I had here. This I had here. And their common link are these, because remember, we know those two are equal to each other. So it's like the green part links the other two pieces. Therefore, I'm going to use transitive property. Now in step 8, I'm going to erase all this except for this stuff. In step 8, look at from step 7 to 8 what changed. These are the same. These are the same. Just these two pieces changed. Well, if you go look up here, DE and CD are the same. HG and FG are congruent. So all they did was substitute this for this and this for this. So then in step 9, because these are the same, they've gathered those together. These are the same, they've gathered those together. They collected like terms, which we can call substitution. So you then want to look at step 9. What do I need to go to from here? If you get stuck here, go look again at what you're trying to prove. We are trying to prove that FH and CD are congruent. So somehow, I want to say that FH and CD are equal to each other. Well, how do I go from there to there? I divide both sides by 2, and it gets me those by itself. At that point, because I know they're equal, I can say those pieces are congruent to each other. And that is based on definition of congruent segments. And our final proof, the one that you had to do really all by yourself. You're trying to figure out, you're using the things they give you, looking at what you're trying to prove, figuring out how to get there. So remember our first step, and you always want to number your steps. You always want to write out everything that's given. And you can do all of that in one step. and that is given. Okay, I put these little lines here for me just so I could keep it a little better organized. So you want to look at your picture. They've told me that something is bisecting an angle. So if I scroll down, definition of an angle bisector, something's an angle bisector. I said it splits into two congruent angles. So look at your picture. If this is a bisector, that makes those two pieces congruent. So I'm going to say angle 1 is congruent to angle 2. And that is definition of angle bisector. I cannot jump to say those measures are equal because remember, in our proof packet, all it's saying are the two pieces are congruent to each other. It doesn't say anything about equal to each other. Now, what do I almost always say after I say two angles or two segments are congruent? Well, I say then that their measures are equal to each other. And my reason is definition of congruent angles. Now, look at what I'm trying to prove. I'm trying to solve for x. Did they give me values for 1 and 2 that I could possibly substitute in? Well, here they tell me measure of angle 1 is that, so I'm going to substitute for the measure of angle 1. And I'm going to substitute measure of angle 2 with 4x plus 22. I'm replacing one thing with another thing. That has to be substitution. And at this point, I'm just trying to get x by itself. So go through your algebraic steps. You could either divide both sides by 2, or you could go ahead and distribute. I'm going to decide to distribute. So my reason is distributive property. From there, I'm going to subtract 2 on both sides and subtract 4 on both sides. I'm going to go ahead and put that in one step because I'm using subtraction property for both of those. How do I get x by itself? I'm going to divide both sides by 2, so my reason is division property. Now, I recommend you guys practicing some more proofs, maybe go back and re-practice some of these, and then check them. Repetition and continuing to practice helps. Do not use your homework key while you do the proof. Check it after you completely finish. If you're looking at my answer key while you're doing the proof, you're not truly going to be doing it by yourself. So just keep working on these. I recommend practicing this weekend. Remember, you have a quiz Tuesday, and the quiz Wednesday will be open notes proofs.